currently we don't hear necessarily from a whole bunch of really important components like species at risk or like marshes that are filtering water and taking carbon dioxide out and being this ecosystem that provides us all with resilience to extreme weather and things like that. They don't really have a voice without the people that are in these departments. And both at a provincial level and at a federal level, we're seeing adjustments being made that I really think are not making it better for the wildlife. It's making it more of a challenge.
Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. I'm Connor Curtis, Director of Communications at Sierra Club Canada, and I'm not your host today. Today we have an interview for you with Dr. Stefan Petersen, the Director of Conservation and Research for the Assiniboine Park. The interview is hosted by Sierra Club Canada board member Andrea Miller. But before we get into their chats, we have a new action that you can take for species at risk on our website. Nature is at the core of Sierra Club Canada's new strategic plan. But as Gretchen Fitzgerald, our executive director, writes, quote, "Just before Parliament rose for the summer, the Government of Canada rolled out what I am calling the Extinction Paper, a series of rollbacks and undemocratic changes that would make it even easier for fossil fuel and nuclear industries, aided by elected officials who would be willfully ignorant of the impacts of their decisions, to drive species to extinction, approve pipelines before routes were even known, and create zones where environmental safety laws simply do not apply," unquote. That's why right now, Sierra Club Canada supporters are calling elected officials and asking them what they are doing to stop the Extinction Paper from becoming law. Will you join them? Find that action linked in the description or by visiting sierraclub.ca. We also have a ton of other petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Hobbiton Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us.
Hi, Stefan. Nice talking to you today about Arctic animals.
Great. It's great to be here talking. It's always good to talk about Arctic animals, I think.
That's great. So what initially got you into studying Arctic animals, and sort of what keeps you going with studying Arctic animals?
Yeah. I actually didn't start with Arctic animals. At one point I made myself a nice little graph for presentations that showed the increase in body size as I continued my career. So I really started out with shrews and then went to flying squirrels and then went up to like seals and polar bears and then more recently working on whales as well. So I've kind of been moving towards Arctic animals over time. I think that there was larger questions that really got me excited, and then really amazing opportunities that I was fortunate to have that led me to Arctic animals in particular. There's so much cool stuff out there. You need like little nudges along the way to get you where you're going to go.
It was kind of chance. It was a little bit by chance.
Yeah, a little bit. I was interested in genetics as it was kind of developing. It's really been a nonstop kind of advancement in genetics over the last 20 years. So I started out, I was interested in kind of how animals were related to each other, more biogeography. But then I really wanted to use genetics to look at more like contemporary gene flow because it seemed more similar to what you could use to make decisions and kind of actively help species in the wild. And then that brought me to kind of the genetics that I used in my PhD for, polar bears and seals and Peary caribou. And then that kind of led, that was my introduction to the Arctic in terms of research.
Great. And so if I'm not correct, if you're the Director of Conservation and Research at Assiniboine Park Conservancy, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's correct.
So can you tell us a bit about what you do day to day within that
Yeah.
work?
Yeah, I should just tell you all the exciting things I do day to day because a lot
Okay.
of my day to day is writing grants and reporting on grants and not the more fun stuff. But basically, in about 2009, Assiniboine Park Conservancy was formed, and it kind of transitioned the zoo, Assiniboine Park Zoo, and Assiniboine Park into a new phase where it was a not for profit that was managing a city asset. And so at that time, there was some really big decisions. And one of the big decisions was how do we make sure that the zoo is really a modern zoo? And a big part of that is what are you doing in the world to conserve animals? And so I was hired to start the team that now is our conservation and research department. And it focuses not only on how we can use science to help animal welfare with animals that we have in our care, but how can we be helping animals in the wild? And so we do work on endangered butterflies in the south of the province, and we work with Manitoba mud puppies across a big range of the province, and we have a really strong focus on Arctic species. So, polar bears, but then also Arctic seals and beluga as well.
In your work, how have you seen that climate change is reshaping Arctic ecosystems? Like, what
Yeah.
have you witnessed in your field work?
Yeah. So, I've been going up to Churchill now for almost 20 years every year, and often three times a year. So, in the spring, we'll go up kind of focused on seals often, and then in the summer for beluga, and then in the fall, we have some polar bear projects. And so, part of it is kind of noticing wilder variation, really, years where the ice sticks around for a long time and what that means for, the town and for bears and for the seals and everything else. And then other years where it's gone really quick and you get bears on shore and you see conflict increase and all these other things around bears. But I think talking to people in Churchill who have a much longer time frame and knowledge of that area is is often the most like striking times where you're on a tundra vehicle with a guide that's been coming out for since the 80s and talking about how you used to be able to see over the shrubs, but as things warm up those shrubs are growing bigger, and so that landscape is changing in ways that I wouldn't even necessarily notice, but they're trying to navigate through that. Or you talk to someone who's, normally out in the spring sea ice hunting for their dog team, and, how the changes in that sea ice has made it so you have to be a lot more careful, or you can't do certain things at certain times of the year. So it's those longer term kind of knowledges that really um, usually where they hit home more than the relatively short little times window that I have up in Churchill.
Yeah. I've actually never been to the Arctic. I've always wanted to go. What's it like up there? Like, how close are you getting to a polar bear?
Yeah, it really depends on where in the Arctic you are. You know, I've had the really been really fortunate to spend lots of time in Churchill, but I also have spent time in the high Arctic and Arctic Bay and Pond Inlet and around there for, shorter time periods. And so Churchill's kind of more subarctic, where you get elements of the Arctic, but you also get elements of the boreal forest all coming together in this really vibrant ecosystem. Whereas if you're up in Arctic Bay, you're getting like true Arctic and just like all of the amazing elements that come with that. In Churchill, we get all the Arctic seals, but then we also have harbor seals, which are more of a temperate seal, which we've done a lot of work on because they're fascinating, and that interplay and the trade off with time between more harbor seals as the environment gets better for harbor seals. And we have indicators from colleagues that are doing aerial surveys that for ring seals, it's getting worse. And they're the true Arctic seal. So, you know, trying to understand that change and those trade-offs and how where we're going to end up is pretty fascinating in a place like Churchill, where it's easy to see new species kind of come in, as opposed to the high Arctic, where you see different set of changes. So maybe not new species necessarily, but changes in the ecosystem that makes it either harder to see certain species or actually see species decline.
Right. But you're seeing polar bears out there. Is
Oh
this
yeah,
not,
yep.
must be pretty
Yeah, so
scary.
Churchill's a pretty amazing spot where the Western Hudson's Bay and the Southern Hudson's Bay population are polar bears are both adapted to not having any ice during the summer. So the way that plays out is bears in the spring this time of year are out on the sea ice, but that sea ice is melting and mostly gone. I have a needy cat around here. I hope that's okay. And the way the current is, those bears will come off along the shore, along the coast of Manitoba, along kind of the Wapusk National Park coast, and then into Ontario. And they'll hang out during the summer. But then in the fall, the sea ice forms first up closer to Churchill. So you get this movement of bears kind of past Churchill. And that's where we see like the ecotourism that's been built up around come to Churchill. And then you can go and see polar bears at quite close distances in really safe ways from Churchill. So,
Wow.
yeah.
Wow. Um, so can you say a little bit more about the biggest threats that Arctic wildlife are facing right now? Maybe
Yeah, for sure.
maybe which ones we're not talking about enough. I don't know if there are any that you think that we
Yeah.
should be talking about more.
Yeah, I think in terms of what I think we're not talking about is probably all of the lower trophic level, the things that make up the food chain that we don't really know a lot about. Um, a couple years ago, ourselves and colleagues with a couple of organizations went and collaborated to do some trawl surveys in off the coast of Churchill to start to try and understand just what's supporting all these really great numbers of beluga whales or seals or polar bears too, right? Because we have relatively lots of research on those big charismatic species.
Mhm.
Um, we so our approach, because we really know so little, we went and did trawl surveys, but then we used DNA barcoding to identify all these species and then worked really hard to make sure that those samples and that information got made part of public records. So, you know, the Manitoba Museum now has a big collection of marine invertebrates from the trawl survey, and DFO has a collection, and we've been all working together to really understand what what's supporting beluga whales and what's supporting seals in different ways. Everyone wants to talk about the charismatic big species, including myself. I have a
Yeah.
soft spot for especially seals, but we probably have a better sense of how we think it's going to play out for those species um, in relation to sea ice, because we know they depend on sea ice so closely for many of them. And it's pretty clear that as we lose sea ice, as it's around less in critical time periods like the spring, that's going to have direct effects on, you know, body condition and population sizes eventually, and that, you know, the risk that that population has to be extirpated completely from the area.
Yeah, so I totally agree. The charismatic animals. I of course want to talk about polar bears. So
And we totally can. I'm I joke that often when I'm giving tours, I say, like, I'll tell you lots of things. I'm going to try and convince you that seals are way more interesting than polar bears. But then I have to admit that I have no, I've convinced no one in,
I mean, seals are
10 or
great.
20 years.
Um, but what I find so interesting about polar bears, in terms of the environmental movement, is that they've really been this symbol of climate change.
Yeah.
And a lot of environmental activists find this not a terribly helpful symbol because, of course, it really, I mean, I've never been to the Arctic. Many of us have never been to the Arctic. So it seems like something that's happening very far away to a non-human species, whereas actually climate change is affecting us. So I'm just wondering, what is your take on this? Like, from your perspective, are polar bears kind of a useful indicator species, kind of like, I don't know, the canary of the Arctic,
Yeah.
or or do you see their role in some other way?
Yeah. I think they still are a really useful indicator. I think they've been politicized in a way that's not super helpful and kind of makes that more challenging. Um, but we don't have really long-term data sets for lots of species, but we have for polar bears. And so, because and there goes everything off my desk from the cat.
Oh,
Um, so because there was a research program that was started, 50 years ago now, and we have, regular sampling and a lot of research, we have like this really clear link that we can show, which we don't have for lots of other species. And without that really long link, people's default and even my default is, how do I tease this out from just normal variability versus an actual effect of climate change? Like it's hard for us to get our heads around it. But in polar bears, it's quite clear, less sea ice in the spring or longer time on land, poorer body condition, fewer cubs. It fits right along. Um, so that coupled with how evocative polar bears are, I think is a really powerful combination that's been weakened by like the politicization of polar bears as that symbol, which is unfortunate. But like at the zoo, we are interested in lots of other species that have been impacted by climate change and more immediate or local threats. And often like people coming to the zoo, visitors, they're not excited. They're not excited to see, the critically endangered butterfly that we raise or, the slimy mud puppy. And when I present, I really love to do this stuff on freshwater mussels and our organization, people would be like, it doesn't have a face. I don't think, I think you should choose better, but whereas polar bears, you don't have to convince people that they're important. Like you don't have to convince people that they should care about a huge, cuddly yet deadly top predator in the Arctic. So I think there is still real power to that symbol. Um, just needs maybe to be reclaimed a little bit.
right. Well, maybe someday we can talk about the butterflies because I actually think that's really interesting too. But but coming back to polar bears, um, was there a moment for you in your field work that really kind of crystallized it for you that polar bear conservation is just really urgent?
Yeah, I think I I mean it's hard not to, it's probably not seeing a bear as much as seeing a figure of a population for me as a scientist. So, there's a there's a great figure that I saw that was produced by researchers at Environment Canada that had the average mass of females that they had captured in the fall. And it's kind of been declining. There's variation, but it's been declining over time. And then they had another line that was the the heaviest or the lightest female that had produced young successfully. And those two lines are are getting closer and closer together. And when they cross, then most of the females are going to be too small to have young successfully. And so it's like it's figures like that where I'm like, yeah, this is a real thing that that is progressing, and we need to find ways to make changes and and fix that as much as we can for polar bears, or you know, we're going to expect to lose them here in Manitoba. Polar bears have a huge range, um, and most of the polar bears aren't Manitoba polar bears. Most of them are in the high Arctic, so there's there's time to make changes to help polar bears. There's less time to make changes for polar bears in Manitoba and in Ontario. And so, you know, those kind of more science, I guess, moments are really impactful for me. Whereas I know for other people, it's their first time on a tundra vehicle meeting eyes with a polar bear and just like staring into their eyes where you're like, oh, we need to change course here.
I get what you mean though about the sort of statistics or kind of graph. I remember when I was a kid, I went to the zoo in Calgary. I grew up in Nova Scotia, but I used to go visit Calgary, and I remember seeing this, I don't know, little sign at the zoo. It was like a big square that was saying, it was huge, like a rectangle. This is the human population. And then there was this little tiny rectangle and it said, this is all other primates. And that actually left a huge impression on me. And I thought, maybe that was like one of the seeds that got me interested in conservation. So I see what you're
Yeah, and it's funny how these little moments kind of like can really make a big impact. I know at at one point, very much long ago, I was seeing a girl and we were talking about tigers, and she didn't know that like every tiger was endangered, like all of the subspecies. And that was like, oh, this isn't the right fit sort of moment, like big split from that. And then, a couple of years ago, we were talking and doing some planning to 2030. And I thought, oh my God, there's a whole bunch of sea ice loss predictions that were for 2030. And I, I'm going to be in 2030 very soon, like terrifyingly soon. What what have I done? What have we done? What's that going to look like? So yeah, the power of small moments, I think, can't be overstated.
Yeah. Um, if I understand correctly, part of your work at Assiniboine Park Conservancy involves the Leatherdale International Polar Bear Conservation Center. Is that right?
That is, yeah. Yep.
So, could you tell me about the work that you do and that the center does with orphaned cubs?
Yeah, for sure. So it's kind of a story that's meshed with how Manitoba manages polar bears, and that management kind of strategy has changed over time. Um, at one point, they were closing down the dump, and bears went all over the world to different facilities, but there wasn't really any tracking on those bears, and so at a certain point, there was a really horrible situation that bears were in a circus. There was a Winnipeg Free Press reporter who came back and kind of blew that story open. And the province changed the regulations so that bears couldn't couldn't go to zoos, couldn't go out of the province.
Mm.
But they were still seeing orphan cubs on a pretty regular basis and didn't have anything to do with how do we manage these orphan cubs. And so for a while they tried fostering them with wild parents, and that it's hard to tease out all the details, but it seems like that didn't work for a number of reasons. And so there their next kind of, I guess, strategy for these orphan cubs was to recognize that, polar bears in good human care have this real strong power to, connect people with the Arctic and connect people with northern Manitoba, connect people with Churchill. And then there's an opportunity, hopefully, to switch that and get people to change their lifestyle in order to benefit those wild bears. So because these orphans, they're usually like 11 months is when they get most often observed. Um, because they can't survive on their own and they would be taken out of the population anyways, the province decided that they could come down to our facility, so to the LIPPCC, that, and then they could go to either across across our road into Journey to Churchill, or they might be able to go to another acceptable facility, but it would all be tracked and the province would retain ownership over those bears so that if they were in a bad situation, the province could order those bears sent to another suitable facility or sent back to Manitoba. So they didn't give up control in the way that that earlier policy had been happened. So these are bears where, and what the exact kind of um, rules around which bears can come down has kind of fluctuated over time. But essentially, currently it's orphan polar bear cubs who've been orphaned because of human bear conflict in and around the Churchill area. Now, not all our bears are from that source because the policy has changed. We do have one bear, Storm, who bit a guy on the butt in Churchill, and the Polar Bear Alert Pro team was able to safely anesthetize them. But then you can't let a bear like that back into the wild because it's too high of risk. So rather than euthanize Storm, the decision was made to come down as well. But the other ones are all orphan cubs.
So the orphan cubs, I understand that the orphan cubs, when they're 11 months old, 12 months old, or what have you, they can't survive out on their own. But when they
No,
get older, they can't ever reintegrate. Is that the problem?
we don't think so. And it's not. I mean, polar bears are really smart, and we think maybe they might be able to, if there's lots of good years and it's really productive, they might be able to last. Um, the challenge is there's already lots of bear human conflict in the north, and bears can move a really long time period or distance. So the risk of releasing a habituated bear back into the landscape is really high, and the government is not willing to take that risk. And we know from kind of where bears move um, that there is movement out of Manitoba into neighboring jurisdictions. So, not only is there risk by northern communities that already have to deal with a high amount of risk from polar bears because they live in their range, but other, Nunavut and Nunavummiut have to deal with polar bears as well. And so all those things together, us not really being confident that we can teach a bear enough about how to be a bear to survive when it is big, and being 100% sure that it would be habituated to humans with our current state of knowledge just makes the risk so high. And so, because those animals would normally not contribute to the wild population, that was decided, and the province is making that decision, that it would be acceptable to take them out if they were going to really, high quality places where they could show normal behaviors and they would be well cared for. And they were part of education campaigns to get people to connect bears with climate change and hopefully to make changes in their life.
That makes sense. Uh,
Yeah.
you had talked earlier about your interest in genetics and helping to understand wildlife populations. So how does genetic science help us protect species, such as polar bears?
Yeah.
Yes, belugas are great, and so are narwhals.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a few ways that genetics can get incorporated. Um, Kind of on the first level, there's there's all this legislation we have that triggers protection in different ways. And so in order to have something, it needs to be definable. And so genetics plays a big role in that now, defining those populations that are the units of conservation. It's not the only way that we define conservation units, but it has big implications. So if we think about polar bears, and in Canada, COSEWIC does the initial assessment and recommends a status, and that status is either accepted and the species is listed by the minister or sent back to COSEWIC. So polar bears, if we look at the unit definition, so the designatable units, what we are calling a wildlife species in Canada, um, we're looking at, is there gene flow? Are there animals moving between all these parts? Or is there a group that we would separate out and say, this group is adapting on its own separate trajectory that in a way that it couldn't be replaced by new individuals plopping there. So if we lost all the bears from Manitoba, if we brand bears from a different area, do we think that they would be the same bears or we would be putting different bears back in there? So currently, bears move a lot. We see gene flow. And so all throughout Canada, COSEWIC has decided that they're one unit. Um, and because there's one unit, there's populations that are stable in the high Arctic and large, and then there's smaller populations in the south, like Western Hudson's Bay, that look like they're in decline. Um, but even though there's all that difference, we put them as special concern, which is, it could become threatened if threats don't change. Um, Whereas if we divided them up, like the provinces do, Manitoba has polar bears listed as threatened, whereas not for the whole population. So there's big implications on how you divide things up and what level of protection they receive from the government. So that's kind of like the assessment side of things. Um, but then there's a lot of work on genomics now, and the ways that we're using genetics are they blow my mind away. I'm just like so so interested. So um, one of the one of the things that a colleague is doing is looking at these epigenetic markers of aging, and so we all have kind of our DNA, and it gets little markers put on and taken off, and some of them are correlated really well with aging. So as you go through life, these things mark and yeah, and to the point where you can sample, a polar bear that you don't know their age, look at these epigenetic markers, and also give its age within a couple of years, which blows my mind. So it's really important for like field biologists, so we can look at non-invasive ways where, we get hair samples and we get genetics. We can look at, you know, is it a male or a female? What is its age? We can look at contaminants in the hair to understand what it's been eating and what it's been exposed to. So we're just getting more and more information that we can manage these populations without having to, you know, be more invasive because we don't always want to do that for a number of reasons. So, yeah, so the kind of these exciting new methods, and it seems like every few years there's more more cool stuff that we can learn from genetics and apply that to the conservation of different species.
So, do you see any signs of resilience or adaptation in polar bears or other Arctic species that maybe are giving you hope?
Yeah, I think I see more resilience than adaptation for the most part. I think it seems like I'm constantly amazed at how individual animals deal with their environment. You know, polar bears, seals, beluga, they're smart, they're learning all the time. They're they're taking advantage when they can of resources. Um, they're facing lots of, challenges along that. Um, but they've also always adapted to a really large amount of variability, and their you know their whole way of living is deals with that variability. So I think that gives me hope in that they're smart, they're learning, they have all this ability to deal with variability. And it's just if we're layering too many extremes on them is where it's really gonna fall apart. So, it's up to myself and my team and everyone to try and figure out ways where we can still have that variability and we can still have these animals, but they're not pushed beyond their limits. And so that means, you know, when I think about the Arctic, it's balancing, how do we make sure that anthropogenic changes like development or how we're on the land are minimal. So that's one less thing they have to deal with. If we're thinking about polar bears, maybe that's like, how do you reduce conflict so that we're not losing bears to human bear conflict? That's one less thing they have to deal with. Um, and then on the other side, one of the great kind of opportunities working in a zoo is we have visitors that are coming by, they're connecting with people, and we have this opportunity to try and get them mobilized either to, be having discussions with their elected officials for, change, whether that's renewables, whether that's species protection, whether that's, voting with their dollars in order to push the market to places that are better for animals. There's all these sorts of ways. Um, and working at a zoo is like an opportunity that I certainly didn't have before I came to the zoo in academia or working for the federal government. So, you know, making sure that we're really trying to connect people in the best ways and give them tools and, either reduce barriers for them to make a change or, raise their knowledge level, whatever it takes to try and um, bring more people together to make all small changes that then lead to some really big changes. That's kind of the two parts of how I see us going forward successfully, I guess.
Yeah. The sort of you talking about people connecting with people, it makes me think about citizen science somewhat.
Yeah.
So are you still involved with beluga bits? Is this
Yeah.
still the case? Can you tell us about beluga bits and why citizen science is so important in terms of
Yeah.
conservation?
Yeah. There's so many ways where, people can get engaged in science and help in really, concrete ways. So we started the Beluga Bits program a few years ago, and then COVID really gave us a boost because everyone was stuck at home. But essentially, we work with partners and we collect underwater video from the Churchill River estuary during the summer, and that's when all the beluga are there. So we collect all that underwater imagery. We run it through an AI to get rid of all of the no beluga photos, and then we put it into Zooniverse and the Beluga Bits project on Zooniverse, and we get people to help us classify those images. And so I think we're over 40,000 people have helped us classify images. I think we're over 10 million classifications. So people will go on, and it could be a task like, you're given a picture that has a whole bunch of beluga and you're asked to draw a box around all of the beluga. And then we take that and we use programming to cut out all the individual beluga. And then we'll make another workflow where people will be asked, is the image a good quality image? Can you see the whole side of the animal? Can you see just the teeth? Like these different questions. And then those all go into a big database where we ourselves and other scientists will ask questions. So, we want to know about where and when we see calves in the estuary. We can pull all of that information out and really easily look at where in the estuary calves are, when we start seeing them in the year, and then that can directly recommend what we might want to do with shipping or speed limits for boats or like all these really practical sorts of applications. Um, yeah, so people get a great fun time looking at awesome underwater beluga photos. And at the end of it, there's like a big pile of data that can be asked, so many questions about that help manage, but help us learn about beluga whales as well. So, yeah, I'm a big fan of both beluga bits, but also iNaturalist. If people want something, outside and in their backyard, the iNaturalist app, you can use it as a field guide, but it also collects observations of animals and plants in your backyard. And that information is really great because we've often used it in COSEWIC assessments because someone who is just out and really curious about, a bug suddenly has a new location of an endangered species or something really exciting like that. So many ways that people can get involved and excited about science and learn about things. And yeah, I think they're a lot of fun too.
Yeah. So you were talking about beluga beds, and you talked about how AI separates out the photos where there is no beluga.
Yeah.
But can AI do this work of determining if the photo is good or not good, or how much of the beluga you can see?
Um, I would say AI is getting better all the time, but it still humans tend to be better at the tasks that we're giving it. So it would take us a lot to train um, how to recognize like the age class of a beluga. And so it's hard to train because beluga calves are gray, and then as they get older, they get whiter and whiter. And when they're adults, they're this gleaming white beluga color that we all are familiar with. But if it's an overcast day, that changes the color. If it's cloudy water, that changes the color. So you're you have to train the AI to almost recognize kind of the weather conditions and
Hmm.
the murkiness of the water as well as how to age a beluga. Um, Whereas we can train people with a few short tutorials to get pretty accurate about that. So there's different ways that we can use AI. I think with enough data, we might be able to do some stuff, but currently people are way better. Um, and the thing that we don't get from AI that we have gotten from our volunteers on Beluga Bits is through the questions and the discussions that we have, really like interesting and things we hadn't think of problems are highlighted. So we had a separate workflow. We were seeing lots of jellyfish in the beluga pictures. So we started a workflow that was for identifying jellyfish, whereas that, okay, there's lion's mane jellyfish and there's like two comb jellies, identify them. And then over time, we ended up with a lot of messages that were like, well, what about this one? Well, what about this one? And it turns out that there was two other species of comb jelly that we didn't realize were in that system. They hadn't been reported from Churchill Estuary. Um, and so we have this really cool side project now looking at, jellyfish as indicators of that ecosystem, but also maybe changes in that ecosystem if we have those jellyfish really well characterized. If there's more shipping at the Port of Churchill and we get jellyfish as an invasive, we have a way to sample hundreds of hours during the summer to maybe detect some of these newcomers to the ecosystem. But an AI would never, like, it would just classify all those into the closest thing. It wouldn't flag that there's something different or something new or in that system. So there's a real power and to the care and attention and questions that come out of the community that builds around um, a citizen science project or a community scientist project.
So can anybody take part in beluga beds? Yeah.
Yeah, if they have internet, um, they can go on. Um, I like I like scoring my progress. So if you create a profile, which is free, it'll track, how many classifications you've made or things like that. But you can go in on as a guest as well. Um, and we try to always have at least one workflow going, but sometimes there'll be multiple workflows. Um, yeah, and you can help out by checking out Beluga and answering a few questions around that.
So that's one way that people can support conservation. Is
Yeah,
there any other way that you can think of that ordinary Canadians can meaningfully support Arctic conservation efforts?
yeah. I think there's probably, I don't know, there's probably a lot, but I like to focus on kind of a few that are more specific. So right now, there's, you know, there's lots of changes in the world. There's lots of changes in our political landscape. There's lots of changes in laws, like our Species at Risk Act. There's lots of things that are being proposed. So get involved and get engaged. And when things come forward, be ready to lend your voice or talk to your MLA or your MP or your local government to say, hey, this is not really in the best interests of wildlife or, climate emissions, which have a direct impact on Arctic wildlife as well. So there's lots of things. You want your government to support more renewables rather than the standard kind of what they've been doing all along. Things like that. You have this voice both on that political realm, but also in the people that are around you as well. So, you can be talking to friends. You can, and you have an access. We know we share a lot of information with people we trust. So you trust your friends. You don't have to give your friends lectures or anything like that. But
That would be popular.
but you can maybe ask some questions about why they have a certain opinion, and wouldn't there be a way where we could have both wins for the environment and for the economic trade-offs or whatever is being traded off? So there's those real things in their life. Um, there's ways that you can accomplish things and help yourselves. So I always think of, you know, I I have a 5-year plan for my department. I have a 10-year plan for my organization. I have, goals in my house to do this and that. I can set myself a 5-year plan to reduce my climate impact, my carbon footprint. You know, a lot of that stuff is going to get accomplished as we move to electrical transport and move away from fossil fuels. But, you know, try a really great recipe that's lower on the food chain and doesn't involve such, high intensity, climate emitting food that's, shipped around the country or is really expensive that way. Um, yeah. And then there's lots of really great organizations that are doing incredible things for conservation in the Arctic, and across Canada. And people should, I think, consider supporting them in different ways, whether that's volunteering for them, for in our small patch of the world in Winnipeg. I don't think people realize that even, coming to visit the zoo or visiting the park and the leaf and the attractions that we have, that money helps support our conservation efforts in different ways. So, it could be a direct donation to an organization that's working, but it could be supporting them in other ways that are more in line with what you want to do. You want to have a great day out with your family at the zoo. That's awesome, but you're also helping conservation, and that's really important as well.
So, last question. You were talking a little bit about using your voice. So, I'm wondering what policy changes or protections, say in the next decade,
Yeah.
what would make the biggest difference for Arctic wildlife?
Yeah, I mean, right now there's there's a lot of changes in kind of staffing at federal level, um, that's quite concerning to me because I don't think there is enough people doing the jobs of looking out for wildlife to start with. I'm 100% biased because of kind of the realm I work in, but I also see lots of, you know, young up and coming professionals not getting contracts renewed right now as the government is trying to reduce all the departments by 15%, across the board. So, you know, we're seeing these broader cuts to departments that are looking out for wildlife and looking out for ultimately our our safety and our good and our health by keeping the environment, strong and resilient. And so I have real concerns currently that we're seeing this quiet shift and quiet kind of siphoning off of all the people that would be working really hard to maybe help the environment and protect species at risk and things like that. So, um, I think a policy change that would, invest in the structures and the people that protect the environment, um, would be amazing to see. And that could be, more investment in communities to, indigenous guardians or communities to steward and really prioritize species at risk within their jurisdiction, their local area, their community, to their scientists and staff that are out there looking for, the rare species to make sure that if there's something proposed, that that's voiced. Those rare species get a voice and are balanced in the decision to put in a pipeline or put in, a new mall or whatever it's going to be. I realize that these are all decisions that we make, but currently we don't hear necessarily from a whole bunch of really important components like species at risk or like marshes that are filtering water and taking carbon dioxide out and being this ecosystem that provides us all with resilience to extreme weather and things like that. They don't really have a voice without the people that are in these departments. And both at a provincial level and at a federal level, we're seeing adjustments being made that I really think are not making it better for the wildlife. It's making it more of a challenge. So there's always trade-offs. We're always making decisions. We always need to be making decisions, but we should be honestly weighing what those trade-offs are as much as we can.
Well, I like what you say about how we all need to be using our voices to call attention to these issues.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Stefan. I really enjoyed talking to you and meeting you, and I hope to talk to you some other time about butterflies.
Yeah, yeah, it's been a great conversation. If we're talking about butterflies, I have really amazing conservation scientists with me that will be much better to talk to about the amazingness of butterflies.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, take care.
Before we end today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. And once again, remember to take action for nature. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Hopgen Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe to get the latest episodes from us.